Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak on the Education Amendment School Safety Bill, and this bill, in effect, as others have said, is an amendment to the Education Act that allows the Minister to issue students with a non-attendance order from schools on the following grounds: serious violent conduct, in this case, regardless of whether the student cannot or might not be held criminally responsible for the conduct, for example, loss of life, serious physical or psychological injury, serious damage to property, serious offence of a sexual nature, animal cruelty, and or the student supports terrorism or violent extremism. And the Minister believes on reasonable grounds that the action is necessary to protect the health and safety of students and staff in any school. The opposition is concerned, as everyone else in this community, about increasing levels of violence and radicalisation in our schools. We have seen in the last few years the terrible consequences of these trends in our schools, with cases of children being sexually assaulted by their classmates or students in older classes in primary schools in this state, just as one example. We have seen young people involved in terrorism activities. Our schools should be places of education, of enjoyment, of fulfilment, of opening young minds to the thoughts and teachings of others. They should be places where young people learn how to live a life of meaning in an increasingly complex world. But most of all, for everyone, they must be safe places. From my perspective as the Shadow Minister for the Prevention of Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault, I want to focus in my discussion of this bill on students who engage in serious violent conduct, particularly in relation to sexual assault. Labor has a commitment to improving the support that we give to students to live a life free of violence. I have schools in my electorate, for example, where primary school principals have said to me, "Jenny, if we could stop the children experiencing violence at home, our educational outcomes would really start to improve. That would be our game changer." And the member for Port Stephens spoke very eloquently and articulately around the issue that we have when violence in the home is not addressed, and that starts to then play out in schools. And this is of grave concern to us in this side of the House. There seems to be a grave reluctance from this government to address programs of prevention and early intervention in the earliest years of education. While they're very happy to put the dot points into the curriculum for high school students on respectful relationships, they have not done that in primary schools, and that is something that we on this side of the House are very committed to. We know that children need to learn about the dangers of violence. Even back when I was a girl, which was a very long time ago, children were taught stranger danger, not to blindly trust strangers and to ensure that they do everything they can to stay safe. Yet we also know from research that this only addresses some 30% of sexual assault. We let our children into the world, the big bad wide world, only prepared for 30% of the risks that they will have from a sexual assault. We know that children are more at risk from sexual assault and physical violence from someone they know. Why are we not preparing them for that 70% of threat that they will face from someone they know? Discussing violence and sexual assault within families is a difficult conversation to have. It's an even harder discussion to have. And we know in this state how hard it is, because we've seen the response to programs like Safe Schools in our state, where people get hysterical and don't want to discuss those issues. But these conversations, as difficult as they are ones that must be had in order to protect young people in our community. We have the capacity to teach children at a young age about positive social behaviour and interactions. Kindergarten is just about that. Yes, you learn to write, you might learn to read, but it's full of training about how to get on in a group environment. Sit down, be quiet, respect your teachers, don't speak when someone else is speaking, share your resources, help people when they need it, don't fight. These are all positive learning behaviours that we teach our students in kindergarten, but we cannot go to the next step and engage them in learning about respectful relationships in this state. I spoke earlier this year with Dr Phil Lambert PSM, the Deputy Chair of Our Watch, which is the joint Commonwealth State framework for preventing violence against women and their children. As the former General Manager of the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority, as the Fellow of the Australian College of Educators, as the Fellow of the Australian Council for Educational Leaders, and a recipient of the Public Service Medal for his contribution to leadership in education and work in the community to prevent violence against women and girls, Dr Phil Lambert is a very qualified person to speak on this subject. I was very privileged and honoured to speak to him about it and to hear what he had to say. And one of the things that he said to me which really stuck in my mind was that at a recent conference in Lisbon in Portugal on curriculum, there was an overwhelming resolution about what the most important curriculum item that we need to impart to young people today is. Now, you know, being the mother of a son who's just finished the HSC, I would have thought STEM, you know, because that's what we get told. But no, it was actually respect. The one thing that teachers around the world are saying to curriculum designers that they need students to learn more about is respect. We need to give our students those lessons. And so these are just some of the reasons that Labor has pledged to extend respectful relationships education into primary schools. We have pledged that if we are elected to government in 2019, we will...
Member for Parramatta Rising, point of order.
Mr Speaker, I'd ask the member to speak about the bill rather than I think she's diverged off the subject.
Yeah, I'm sure the member is only strayed momentarily. Please return to the lead of the bill.
Thank you. I'm just there in the next sentence. Thank you, Mr Speaker. We will join Our Watch because New South Wales is the only state in Australia that has not joined Our Watch.
Speaker.
I said in the next sentence. Could I just get to it?
Just ask you
Member for Parramatta.
and I think it's flagging your ruling.
I think that she is moving directly to the leave of the bill, and I would advise her to do so.
Labor wants to work with experts like Dr Lambert and the many other members of Our Watch and with experts in other Australian states to do everything that we can to reduce violence in our community. Exactly 1 year ago, I met with Professor Simon Hackett, who is the Professor of Applied Social Sciences at Durham University in the UK. In a multitude of roles, Professor Hackett has worked in child protection and has undertaken a significant amount of research into children who engage in harmful sexual behaviours. And he was one of the first authors, or he was the first author of the recently developed NSPCC National Operation Framework on Harmful Sexual Behaviours in Children in the UK. Now, Professor Hackett spoke to me at length about his work in this area. Of particular interest to me was his work on children with harmful sexual behaviours, particularly his longitudinal work studying these children and the long-term outcomes they have for rehabilitation. And that is really to the nub of what we are talking about in this bill. Particularly, we've just had notification just before I met with Professor Hackett, for example, of an allegation of sexual assault by two 12-year-old boys against a 6-year-old girl at a primary school here in Sydney. So it was very timely as a discussion. Now, Professor Hackett discussed his joint study with Phillips Mason and Balfe of 2013, which was published in the Child Abuse Review, which was individual, family and abuse characteristics of 700 British child and adolescent sexual abusers. And this research examined the characteristics of these children from 9 UK services over a 9-year period in the early 2000s. The research found, and I'm reading from the abstract here, that the most common age for referral of these kind of sex offenders was 15 years of age. That is, the offenders were 15, although a third of those referrals related to children aged 13 or under, and that is generally speaking children who would be at primary school, hence why we believe we need respectful relationships earlier. The abstract went on to say that 38% of the sample were identified as learning disabled, leading again to the comments made by the member for Port Stephens about those particular risks. Surprisingly high rates of sexual and non-sexual victimisation were present in the backgrounds of children and young people referred. When Professor Hackett spoke to me about this research, he said that the numbers went about 50-50 for having suffered physical or sexual assault in the population of children who sexually harm others. These are real statistics. This is 700 of these people. They have done the research. It's not just, you know, trying to excuse someone for a bad behaviour. It's actually based on evidence. Only a very small number of the students or children appeared to suffer some level of psychopathology which wasn't explained by a personal lived experience of abuse or a learning disability. Mr Speaker, can I please seek a small extension of time?
The question is that the member's time be extended. All of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The member's time is extended.
Thank you. The study also found that a wide range of abusive behaviours was perpetrated, with just over half of the sample having penetrated or having attempted to penetrate another individual. This is not just playing doctors in the back. Victims were usually known to the abuser, but in 75% of cases were not actually related to them. So these would be friends and other students. 51% of the sample abused females only, although 49% had had at least one male victim. This analysis indicates that these behaviours are not just one-off events. We need to stop them. It's not enough just to exclude these children from school and hope that they will stop offending. And I was extremely interested in Professor Hackett's further comments to me about what interventions made a difference for these child perpetrators. And that brings me to the amendments that Labor put forward last night in the Upper House, which the government has agreed to. And that was those who completed their education were significantly more likely to live a life without further reoffending. When the researchers drilled down on what this actually looked like, they found that education completion was generally associated with a strong adult mentor or support person in their lives. Those who were excluded and isolated were the ones who went on to reoffend. Professor Hackett described it to me basically as those children who were told that they were monsters, who were isolated from others and never learnt to have respectful relationships with other people, never got to have respectful relationships. And that is why the amendments that the opposition has successfully argued in that place are so vital, and that is to ensure that there is a plan of support implemented for students issued with non-attendance. And then it also brings us to the practicality, that the plans or enrolment directions must consider practical measures such as distance travel options, age and intellectual capacity appropriateness. And I'm glad that the government, under pressure, has agreed to these amendments. We cannot leave these children to work it out themselves, to exclude them from what could be, for many of them, the only place in their entire lives where they can experience a supportive and nurturing learning environment where they can learn more positive behaviours. We must provide some kind of support to stop these children becoming recidivists. It's incredible to me that the government, which speaks so much about reducing recidivism and domestic violence, indeed it's the only priority that this Premier has in relation to domestic violence in this state, that they would not be making legislative changes that would support a reduction in recidivism for children and adolescents who have committed their very first violent acts. Most importantly, we need to ensure that these programs are appropriate, to ensure they are effective in reducing recidivism. So what is currently available in New South Wales to help these child offenders? In September last year, Rachel Olding wrote in the Sydney Morning Herald that the only Sydney service to rehabilitate children who sexually abuse other children, New Street, has 3 times as many referrals as they can fit in, and that some children who have been alleged to have undertaken sexual offences would be ineligible to enter the program. And these situations are not isolated. According to the Bureau of Crime Statistics, in 2015, 30 sexual offences on grounds of schools were reported to police, and there are indications that the problem is much wider. New Street is a program which does innovative work. It has 4 sites in Western Sydney, in the Hunter, New England, and Western New South Wales Dubbo in that health district, and they're also looking at a further service for Illawarra and the Shoalhaven. Hopefully Labor's amendments to this legislation will provide the legislative imperative for more resourcing of the program, both in the number of spaces in the program and the locations from where it is offered. The amendments that Labor has asked for on this bill are vital to ensure we don't leave children who are already very vulnerable and who are shown they are not coping with the assaults and the lived experience without support. Without a pathway back into positive relationships, they will not make it. Where are we landing with this legislation? What we've learnt from this process is the government isn't serious about addressing the causes of violent behaviour which is playing out right now in our schools. It took an amendment from this side of the House to actually propose a supportive regime to help reduce recidivism and stop young people from losing their connection with their schools and their communities. and often their families. Time and again we see this government prepared to lock people up, to exclude them, to isolate them without addressing any of the core issues that lead to antisocial, violent or radical behaviours. I've focused exclusively in this debate on violence and sexual behaviour. However, I believe the same is true when it comes to radicalisation of young people. We know there are experts out there who work in this area. We need to ensure those programs are also properly funded.